you know, the original saga was about the father, the children, and the grandchildren. And I mean, that's not a secret to anybody. It's even in the novels.
Hello there.
Hello and welcome to the channel. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time to talk about Labyrinth of Evil by James Luceno. This has been one of the best EU books I've read so far, and so I just wanted to go over some of the highlights that I took from it. The book was released on the 25th of January 2005, so that's a few months just before the Revenge of the Sith came out. It was also marketed as the prequel to that movie and acts as a bridge between it and Attack of the Clones. I've got my copy here where it says the must-read prequel to episode 3, so that's pretty cool. And on the back it says, embark on a breathtaking adventure that pairs Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker on a deadly hunt for the Lord of Evil who has torn the galaxy asunder. The book's also part of the Dark Lord trilogy, so that consists of the Revenge of the Sith novelisation by Matthew Stover, and also includes The Rise of Darth Vader, and that's also by James Luceno. So before we dive a bit deeper into it, I'd actually like to go over some of the misconceptions about the expanded universe, now known as Legends. Some claim that the EU was fan fiction that contradicted each other and the movies, that George Lucas didn't care about it, and that it was never considered canon. Well, this couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, the EU was officially licensed and authorised by George Lucas. He actively approved and vetoed ideas, especially when it came to important characters in the saga. He even gave guidelines for Lucasfilm to adhere to, so that they wouldn't contradict any of his plans for the prequels. He desired it to be consistent from the beginning. He hired people to keep track of the continuity, namely Leland Chi, the Keeper of the Holocron. Chi later elaborated on Lucas's infamous Starlog quote, stating, "Parallel universe suggests that each universe can go in separate directions, which really isn't the case with regard to the EU. The EU is bound by what is seen in the most current version of the films and by directives from George Lucas. There was also a hierarchy system, and everything was treated with the same legitimacy as the movies. It was all considered canon, unless it was marked with the Infinities logo. The authors who worked on it understood that it was canon as well. We also know James Luceno's view on the EU being regulated to non-canon by Disney in 2014. Although George was busy and didn't read the novels, we know that he was a visual person and he enjoyed reading the comics. He even utilised elements of the EU in the prequels, and also in the special editions of the original trilogy. One specific example of this is the character of Aayla Secura, who originally appeared in the comics. She was then featured in Attack of the Clones. Please pay attention to the terminology used in this next clip.
George is all about, fundamental gameplay, and so immediately when he saw that, that was what we were going to do.
He allowed us to give Darth Vader a secret apprentice, which from a canon standpoint is just fantastic.
I would like to discuss the legitimacy of the EU in another video, but for now I just wanted to get the point across that it was all one timeline that aimed to be cohesive, and it also complemented the movies. In fact, that's something that the Labyrinth of Evil does really well. James Luceno actually had direct contact with George Lucas for this novel. It begins with an acknowledgement thanking George for responding to his many queries. I'd like to share a couple of sources that show to what extent he was involved.
What kind of material did Lucasfilm provide you to give you an ability to write that? Did you get a preview of the film or something?
I had the I had the script for the film, and I also had the ear of George Lucas on that one. So anytime that I had a question about a character or I needed permission to take the story in a certain direction, I'd have that input from him.
The story begins on Cato Nemoidia, and its events are referenced by Obi-Wan Kenobi after the Battle of Coruscant in Revenge of the Sith.
Alright, well, you owe me one, and not for saving your skin for the 10th time.
9th time. That business on Cato Nemoidia doesn't count.
Luceno called that line the springboard for exploring Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin's friendship. Almost immediately it's revealed that Anakin received his scar from Dooku's apprentice Asajj Ventress. Her death was originally planned to be included, but it was ultimately excluded from the novel. There's also tie-ins to Genndy Tartakovsky's 2003 Clone Wars microseries, with direct references to Mace Windu single-handedly destroying a tank on Dantooine, and also Kit Fisto as the hero of Mon Calamari.
What?
The second group of episodes in the animated series leads right up to the events that happen in the film. So we get a little background on what was going on right before episode 3.
Anakin is known by the clones as the hero with no fear. He's also referred to as the warrior of the infinite. When we go on to read the Revenge of the Sith novel, that really ties into how he was perceived by the public. Interestingly, Anakin uses a Jedi healing technique to keep a clone trooper from going into deep shock. So he doesn't completely heal him, but he kind of sustains them. I thought that was pretty cool. Throughout the book, Palpatine continues to manipulate him, saying things like anger is natural, and Anakin uses his anger to fuel his rage. Especially at one point when he comes into contact with Dooku's hologram, he shouts, "Dooku, I will kill you." There's also a point where Anakin contemplates what would have happened if he'd never left Tatooine. So he thinks that if Qui-Gon never took him away, he still probably would have done the pod racing. He would have progressed to the point where he could get his freedom, his mother's freedom, and free the rest of the slaves, and then he'd go on to race around the galaxy, and he'd probably still be able to outrace a Jedi. On that note, Obi-Wan says that he can think of worse places to live than Tatooine. I noticed throughout this book that Obi-Wan's pretty solemn. It's something that's not explored much in the prequels, but he says things like he's destined for infinite sadness, and I thought that was pretty heartbreaking knowing what happens to him after the movie. There's a few callbacks as well, but it's not jarring, it's not like nostalgia bait or anything like that, it's used really tactfully. So there's a point where Obi-Wan says that Anakin really is going to be the death of him. There's a point where someone says good luck to Anakin and he says thanks, but there's no such thing.
In my experience, there's no such thing as luck.
There's also a point where Obi-Wan says there is no trying, and Anakin says to him, yes there is, and you're living proof of it. Obi-Wan thinks to himself, as the Chosen One, is Anakin immune? Or is it his duty to protect him to guide him to his destiny? He even asks Anakin if he would forego his destiny for Padme. Anakin wonders, why does fate target the people who are most important to me? Thinking of Padme, there's a scene where Anakin comes up in conversation and Palpatine says to her, Senator Amidala, I do believe you are blushing. Throughout the novel there's points where she's holding onto her abdomen, and we know that it's obviously talking about the twins, but there's a really touching moment where Bail Organa says, I would do anything to protect you and those close to you. So that really got me thinking about the end of the movie where they're trying to decide what to do with the children, and he says that he and his wife will take the girl. I thought that was I actually found that moment really moving, to be honest, when I read it. It's another one of those moments that really ties in well with the movie, and it just seems like a natural thing that would happen. Now we're going to talk about Grievous. We learn a little bit about Grievous's former life. We also learn that he was injured in a shuttle crash. We then find out that Sandhill planned the shuttle crash, but he goes on to promise Grievous a body made by the Geonosians. He's then presented to Dooku to begin his training and understand the ways of the Sith. Grievous has already built up a sizable collection of lightsabers. There's several occasions where he murders Jedi in this book. It's pretty graphic. And even Dooku finds it hard pressed to outduel him.
At that time, there was no background for Grievous, so that was, supposed to be one of the that originally was an important part of the of commissioning, my being commissioned for that novel and creating a background for Grievous. But I had George's input on that too. Because I said I could, I said I could take this in any number of ways. Is there anything that you were thinking about Grievous in terms of his background? And he gave me a few things that allowed me to sort of expand on the character and give him a little bit of background.
But for this, we had to really explore him more. And and George kind of told me about, he had some thoughts about that he was like an old style villain where he fights, but then when he's losing, he runs away.
We had a lot of discussions about lightsabers. How does he know to use lightsabers? Because it's supposed to be like a special gift, and you're supposed to be force sensitive. George kind of told me, oh, maybe Count Dooku teaches him.
How often must I tell you? Control my central line. Good.
I've been trained in your Jedi arts by Count Dooku.
And then we got a call that they wanted to introduce Grievous's cough earlier because our character didn't have it, so we somehow had to maybe link the two together better. And so eventually we ended up doing a little sequence at the maybe 2 weeks before we had to deliver of Mace going out and crushing Grievous's chest, and that's what gives us the connection that all of a sudden he starts coughing.
We learn that the current war was planned by the Sith for thousands of years. We go into a little bit of detail about the Rule of Two, and there's mention of Darth Bane.
The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
At last we will reveal ourselves to the Jedi. At last we will have revenge.
We're told that the Rule of Two was a doctrine more than a rule. We learn that in Attack of the Clones, Count Dooku told Obi-Wan Kenobi about Darth Sidious to confuse the Jedi Council. It goes into a little bit about Dooku's discontentment with the Jedi Order as well.
Hundreds of senators are now under the influence of a Sith Lord called Darth Sidious.
I don't believe you.
Yoda's fears are realised when we find out that Dooku murdered Sifo-Dyas. Then he received his Sith name Tyrannus and erased Kamino from the Jedi archives.
Impossible. Perhaps the archives are incomplete.
If an item does not appear in our records, it does not exist.
It's really drilled into us that the Jedi were blinded to the oncoming darkness, and their enslavement to form would be the failing of the Jedi Order. Many actually blame the Jedi for the war in this story. Mon Mothma even refers to the Jedi as Palpatine's pawns. We also explore the works. It's considered a cemetery and also Dooku's home away from home. It was also the training ground for Darth Maul and Dooku's apprenticeship. Dooku refers to Darth Maul as no more than a minion, just like Asajj Ventress and General Grievous. There's mention of Darth Maul's ship that's still a burned carcass on Theed. That was a really cool detail. We're also told that Darth Maul is from Zabrak, not Dathomir. And there's also mention of Darth Plagueis, and so that's another book that Lucino would go on to write the novel for, where he does tell you that Darth Maul's from Dathomir, but we can talk about that in another video. But there's a tie-in here. It mentions that Quinlan Vos couldn't sense the dark side at the works because he had gone too dark. Yoda says that perfecting the dark side is mastering evil. It talks about 500 Republica on Coruscant, where all the wealthy people live, and Palpatine lived there at the higher level. But there's underground tunnels from the works to there, and upon realising this, Mace Windu says that hundreds of senators are now under the influence of a Sith Lord. There's a really eerie and sinister scene where the clones that are investigating the works, they're murdered by Darth Sidious, and he reveals himself to them as they're dying. There's also mention of Dirge and Urusing. There's also a part where Mace Windu says that Sidious must be rooted out and eliminated. I didn't think that was very Jedi-like, but it also tells us that he excelled at Vapad, which is a fighting technique of dark flirtation. There's a really cool quote where it says, "The essence of being a Jedi doesn't hinge on attaining mastery of the Force, but in attaining mastery over one's self." The book doesn't shy away from the midichlorians either. It says the Jedi are ushered by midichlorians to use the Force. On countering some of Anakin's doubts, Obi-Wan says the Jedi are not a cult. We do not worship a leader of elites. We're also told that when the council cannot agree on a decision, they defer to Yoda's council. We're also told that Yoda can sometimes hear Qui-Gon as if he's in the room. Page 27 goes into Qui-Gon's views of the council. We get a little window into Yoda's views of the war. He asks, are we helping restore balance to the Force, or are our actions contributing to the growth of the dark side? We learn that the Nemoidians accumulated wealth and armies from fungus harvesting. They also have knowledge of secret hyperlanes. We also get a bit of information about the Xi Char, and please let me know if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But their religious beliefs are that meticulous work is like prayer. And they also designed the Mecha Chair, so when that gets recovered, that leads to the investigation for a Sith Lord. The early generation ARC troopers received their training by the Mandalorian clone template Jango Fett. I'll say that again, the Mandalorian template Jango Fett. The clones inherited their combat camaraderie from Jango Fett, and that's the way of his warrior brethren, whether he wants to admit that or not. Interesting note, the clones never paused to consider the repercussions of their actions. So, you know, the chip, it's silly. So in the end, the Jedi are called back to Coruscant, the final act begins, and the rest is history. These are just a few of the highlights that I took away from the book. I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments if you watched all the way through, hopefully. And I honestly can't recommend this book enough. In my opinion, it really enhances the movie. So if you're a prequel fan, go grab this book and let me know what you think. Hopefully I'll see you in the next video if I ever make one. So, thanks.
I have story treatments of 7, 8, and 9 and a bunch of other movies, and obviously we have hundreds of books and comics and everything you could possibly imagine. So, you know, I sort of moved that treasure trove of stories and various things to Kathy, and you know, I have complete confidence that she's going to take them and make great movies.
You were planning on developing Star Wars Episode 7 before you sold Lucasfilm. Can you divulge any of the details you were working on?
The ones that I sold to Disney and everything, they came up to the decision that they didn't really want to do those, so they made up their own. So it's not the ones that I originally wrote. I've kind of lost control of Star Wars, so it's going off in a different path than what I intended. But the first 6 are very much mine and my philosophy. And I think that philosophy sort of goes beyond any particular time, because it's based on history, it's based on philosophy, it's based on a lot of things.